who has never asked for or awaited God's help in various situations in life. In fact, at this very moment, there are many people waiting for the Lord's help, and they are right to do so because, after all, the Bible itself tells us that God is a very present help in times of trouble. It teaches us to cast our anxieties on the Lord because He cares for us. Moreover, the Scriptures record many stories where God's help for His afflicted people was manifested wonderfully. Of course, we could not cite all these stories here in a single video, but I have chosen one of these stories to present to you so that we can reflect a bit on this, because undoubtedly, we all need God's help in some sense. This story pertains to the period when the Jewish people were exiled and subjugated under Persian rule. It was during this time that the events described in the book of Esther took place. Some people have a very mistaken view of the book of Esther, focusing solely on the surprising story of a commoner who married the most powerful king of her time. This type of reading almost resembles old fairy tales or romantic comedies from the cinema. But the story of the book of Esther is much more than that. It is a story about providence, help, deliverance, and divine judgment. Before we reach this point in the story, we need to know that the Jewish people had been taken captive to Babylon under King Nebuchadnezzar. The Babylonian king besieged and conquered Jerusalem, the capital of the kingdom of Judah, destroyed and looted the temple, and deported a large portion of the population to regions within the vast Babylonian territory. Then, after the Babylonian Empire fell to the Persian conquest, the Jews remained exiled and scattered throughout that land. The book of Esther records precisely this period. At that time, the Persian Empire was led by Xerxes I, the biblical king Ahasuerus. As revealed to the prophet Daniel, King Ahasuerus amassed great wealth, more than all his predecessors. According to the revelation given to Daniel, Xerxes undertook many military campaigns against Greece, starting in 480 BC. This is precisely the historical context involving the events narrated in the book of Esther. Most likely, during a meeting to discuss matters related to the offensives against Greece, the episode described in chapter 1 occurred. On that occasion, Ahasuerus held a grand feast, and when he was already drunk, he decided to display his wife, Queen Vashti, to his guests. And here many scholars believe that this exhibition required some humiliating and degrading situation for the queen, which she refused. Regardless, for disobeying Xerxes' order, Vashti was deposed from her position. Possibly about 4 years after Vashti was deposed, Ahasuerus was advised by some of his servants to choose a new queen. The text in Esther 2:1 suggests that Ahasuerus had regretted what he had done to Vashti. However, Persian law made his action of deposing her irrevocable. The king followed the servant's advice to find a new wife. He ordered that beautiful young virgins from all the provinces be gathered and brought as candidates to the palace in Susa. Among these young women was Hadassah, the Hebrew name for Esther. Esther was an orphan and had been raised by Mordecai, her cousin. The Bible tells us that Mordecai was a man who feared God. He certainly educated Esther according to the principles of the Lord's commandments. The biblical text recounts that after a year of preparation, Esther presented herself before Ahasuerus. The Bible tells us that Esther found favor in the eyes of everyone who saw her. So the king loved her more than all the other women and made her queen in place of Vashti, probably between 479 and 478 BC. The biblical text informs us that Esther found favor and kindness before the king more than all the other virgins. In this sense, the qualities demonstrated by Esther were clearly the result of divine providence, which, as we can see later in the story, prepares the stage for God's help to deliver His people. One day, while Mordecai was in the palace courts, he discovered a conspiracy by the eunuchs to kill King Ahasuerus. He quickly told Esther about the plan he had discovered, and she informed the king of what was happening. Naturally, the men responsible for the plot were executed, and the entire incident, including Mordecai's heroic act, was recorded in the royal archives. it is interesting to note that the text does not highlight any immediate reward for Mordecai. Instead, the focus shifts to the promotion of an official named Haman. This stark contrast between Haman's promotion and the lack of recognition for Mordecai is characteristic of the author's narrative style. After his promotion, Haman demanded honor from everyone and became furious because Mordecai did not bow to him, which practically meant that Mordecai did not show him respect. Despite Haman's uncertain origin, he may have been a descendant of Agag, the king of the Amalekites. The Amalekites were ancient mortal enemies of the Jewish people. If this is correct, then we can understand a possible reason for Mordecai's refusal. However, the envious and wicked Haman could not tolerate Mordecai's behavior. He devised a plan to kill not only Mordecai, but all the Jewish people. Haman's plan was a true massacre, giving no opportunity for the Jews to defend themselves. Cunningly, Haman managed to persuade King Ahasuerus, and the extermination of the Jews was decreed. When he learned what was happening, Mordecai tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and cried out loudly. All the Jews who heard the news about the decree in the different provinces took the same action. Mordecai sought Esther to do something about it. At first, Esther was fearful, as no one could enter the king's presence without being invited. At that moment, it had been some time since the king had invited Esther to be before him. But Mordecai reminded Esther that her position might be part of the Lord's purpose to help his people. Mordecai also said that even if she did nothing, surely God's help would come from another place. At that moment, Mordecai showed exemplary trust in God amid adversity. Esther then prayed and fasted, and through God's providence, gained the king's favor. With wisdom from the Lord, she approached the king and invited him, along with Haman, to a banquet. Later, another banquet was also arranged. At this second banquet, Esther told the king about the plan against her and her people, exposing Haman. It is important to know that up to that point, Esther had not revealed she was Jewish. This explains Haman's great distress at the time, as it seems he had no idea he was trying to destroy the queen's people. He was so desperate that he was accused of assaulting Esther when he tried to beg her for mercy. However, it was too late for any change. Haman was hanged on the same gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. Even so, the decree of the Persian emperor could not be revoked, but a new decree granting the Jews the right to self-defense was instituted. Thus, the Jews were able to resist their enemies and killed 75,000 adversaries. It is estimated that there were about 3 million Jews in the Persian provinces at that time. This number explains the possibility of so many enemies against them. Mordecai, the queen's cousin, was also elevated to the position of second in command after the king, exactly the same post that Haman had occupied. Despite some people erroneously trying to use the story described in the book of Esther to justify a false gospel of triumphalism and prosperity, this is obviously not the focus of the book's narrative. In fact, the book of Esther teaches us that God's people often go through intense suffering and persecution. It is common for people to think of God's help as the complete absence of difficulties. But it is essential to know that often God does not deliver his people from problems, but in problems. The guarantee is not the absence of storms amid the turbulent waters of life, but the presence of the Lord in our boat. Believers indeed face periods of crisis and despair. The great truth is that God's people know what it is to suffer. But in such moments, Christians should seek the Lord's help and remain faithful to him, even if this faithfulness costs their lives. We must never forget that God is the Lord of history. He controls and governs all things. So without a doubt, God's help comes at the right time. The story in the book of Esther is proof of this, revealing divine sovereignty in fulfilling his purposes. Interestingly, the book of Esther does not narrate any significant miracles, no extraordinary, supernatural, and inexplicable events. I mean that there was no parting of a sea, as in the Exodus, no collapse of walls, as in Jericho. It seems that everything happened naturally. It seems that nothing deviated from the routine complexities of life behind the Persian court. To give you an idea, not even God's personal name is mentioned in the book of Esther. Yet every detail of this story was part of the Lord's purpose to deliver his chosen people and manifest his glory on earth. The mighty hand of the one who sits on the throne of the universe was at work, even if human eyes could not see it. So, in summary, we can say that the story of Esther is a powerful testimony of divine providence, showing that God is constantly at work, even when we do not perceive it. This biblical account reveals that the Lord uses ordinary circumstances and common people to accomplish his sovereign purposes. Thus, the book of Esther not only narrates a historical episode, but also invites us to trust in God's faithfulness, even in times of great adversity and apparent silence. Through Esther's courage and Mordecai's wisdom, we learn that God's sovereignty is the solid foundation on which we must build our trust and hope. In this sense, we can make some practical applications of this biblical story. First, just as God was working behind the scenes in Esther's and Mordecai's lives, he is active in our lives today. We need to trust that God is in control and that he is orchestrating everything for our good, even when we do not understand his ways. As Romans 8:28 reminds us, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." Second, Esther's courage in approaching the king, risking her life, challenges us to be courageous in our faith, especially in times of crisis. We need to be willing to take bold stands and trust that God will sustain us, just as he did with Esther. Let us remember the Lord's words to Joshua when he said, "Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid, do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." Third, we see that Esther asked her people to pray and fast before making a crucial decision. This example underscores the importance of seeking God's guidance and humbling ourselves before him through prayer and fasting. The best thing we can do when facing significant challenges is to pray to the Lord. Philippians 4:6-7 encourages us not to be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, to present our requests to God. Fourth, the story in the book of Esther teaches us that even when we face persecution, we must remain faithful to God. Mordecai refused to bow to Haman, demonstrating unwavering faithfulness. Similarly, we are called to be faithful, regardless of the consequences. The Apostle Peter, in his first letter, chapter 3, verse 14, reminds us that even if we should suffer for what is right, we are blessed, and we should not fear their threats. Fifth, although God's name is not mentioned in the book of Esther, as we have discussed here, his sovereign hand is evident in all events. We must learn to discern and trust in God's silent work in our lives, knowing that he is always present. Isaiah 55:8-9 teaches us that God's thoughts are not our thoughts, nor are our ways his ways. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are God's ways higher than our ways, and his thoughts higher than our thoughts. This entire story invites us to recognize God's sovereignty and his ability to intervene in the most challenging circumstances of our lives. May we, like Esther and Mordecai, trust in the Lord, seek his face in prayer, be courageous in our faith, and remain faithful in our walk, knowing that he is our very present help in times of trouble.